All right. All right. Well, this is number 60, and it is the final talk. Took us 5 years, and I enjoyed every bit of it. And I hope we all learn a lot of astrology from it. And next fall, I'll be starting an advanced course for the first time in, I think it's 42 years or something like that. I was way too immature at that time. All right, what we're going to do tonight is look at the examples of the synergistic complexes. Synergistic complexes are when several things are all working to the same end, whether that end is pleasant or unpleasant. And what we're going to look at are only the simplest ones, and we're going to try to take very, very obvious, exaggeratedly obvious horoscopes. I had a lot of trouble finding some of these patterns because some of these patterns are very rare. I didn't think they were that rare. And it was sort of almost shocking to me. And I don't even have a mathematical, an astronomical mathematical idea of why it is like that. All right, we're going to start first looking at the hypertrine. And the hypertrine is when two sextiles are linked together and they produce a trine, so that you have 3 planets at least trying to accomplish the same end. This is the horoscope of Meher Baba, and I don't know if anybody here is familiar with him, but I am, that's for sure. He was a very prominent guru in the 20th century, and he wrote some very excellent abstract philosophical things on metaphysics, on spiritual metaphysics. He wrote very good things. I wanted very little to do with the man because the way he made himself known to me, I was not very happy with. I had a friend who was a very enthusiastic and dedicated follower of his, and he wanted to share Meher Baba with me, and somehow the connection was there. And one afternoon, I was just waking up from a nap, and Meher Baba was there, and he was demonstrating his spiritual powers. And I was a little bit angry about it, because he came into my space unbidden and against my will. And apparently what he was trying to do was trying to prove his power to me and his validity as a guru. And I took offense at it. What's that? Ela. Bonnie? Oh, okay. Good evening, Grace. Hey, Ellen. Would you write your mailing address on a piece of paper? Yes.
What year did this happen?
This happened in late 1969. And I was insulted by it, and I felt violated, because we're talking about Meher Baba entering my bedroom and trying to demonstrate his powers to me, because one of his students was a friend of mine and wanted me to become his follower.
So he went at his student's request to somebody else's bedroom?
Yeah, I think it was at my friend's request. not to show off. Among some Indian gurus, there is a thing that they try to demonstrate powers and have their followers because of it. Meher Baba and one of his rivals was Sai Baba, and they both did public demonstrations of magic and power and things.
Call them rivals.
What?
Can't call the two of them rivals.
Well, they called each other out. Meher Baba called Sai Baba out and says, "You shouldn't be doing that," but he was doing it himself. Yes, but he did demonstrations of magic. Oh, okay. All right. At any rate, what happened is I'm still friends with the guy who was the friend, and he has since become a follower of Rudolf Steiner and to some extent Max Heindel, but he still likes Meher Baba and took a pilgrimage with his wife to India about 3 years ago. What we're looking at is the hypertrine. The sun is trine to the moon, and sextiling both of them is Mars. So that's what we're looking at. All of the aspects are very strong. I think there's less than 90 seconds between from the lowest to the highest in a degree sequence. And Mars brings in energy. And this is all about energy. And the way this works, because the Sun is in Pisces, and it's something like Sun and Mars then being something like Mars almost being with Neptune. And that turns out to be charisma. This is a very charismatic man. The Sun is in the first house. It's even right into his physical appearances. He's so charismatic that he has an unusual photogenic nature. You take a picture of him and you see really clearly the attitude that he has in his consciousness, and 5 minutes later you take another picture of him and it looks almost like a different man. The energy that he had and the ability to put that energy into his physical personality was quite amazing. So in this case we're talking about the Mars, Sun, Moon in another martial sign, Scorpio. We see a tremendous amount of energy and it builds up. Now the trine between the Moon and Sun is the second trine, which means it's more contemplative, and the Moon is in the 9th house, which is also contemplative and philosophical. Saturn forms a quincunx with Mercury, and that shows that he has the patience to deal with all kinds of abstract complications, which he was really very good at. So he was deep, and it's the horoscope of a metaphysical philosopher. However, I'm not so sure about his spiritual attainment. The way it works is the Sun is square to Neptune and Pluto. And he doesn't seem to get matters of power. And I don't know whether it's a matter of transliteration and translation or not. This man was called the silent guru because he spent 13 years of his life without uttering a word. But he had a little board with letters on it, and he quickly pointed letters and spell out words. And some of the things that he spelled out were, I am the Supreme Spirit, and I am the Absolute. So the way the Sun square Pluto works out is somehow in his understanding or misunderstanding of his spiritual nature. There's a little bit of megalomania in there, something like that. And this was demonstrated in his relationship to his followers, in that he micromanaged their lives, that they couldn't get married unless he said they could get married and all things like that. That's the Sun-Pluto part. The Sun-Neptune part is somewhat a little delusional. Beside thinking he was the absolute, he liked to go to cowboy movies. And instead of just saying, well, I like cowboy movies, he would alibi for it, or he would say, what I'm doing is silently converting people in the movie audience, even though they don't know it. So, at any rate, this is somebody who really wanted to grow spiritually, because the hypertrine that we're looking at is very high energy. It's very strong, and it's all desire-oriented. It got him there, but despite all of his ability at abstract philosophy, we don't know about his true spiritual nature. That's not clear. It looks like there are problems there. All right? Into what? I still didn't hear the second. 150.
150 to the Pluto.
I don't know. I don't think so. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I didn't look into that. All right, let's.
Can you talk about what he demonstrated to you, or did he do anything?
It was just a demonstration of energy, that he could move things about. Of that variety, yes. All right, does anybody know at all who Martha Ray is? Probably yes. A woman with a very, very huge mouth. She was a comedian, and she was an actress, and she was, for most of her life, she was on stage. At age 3, she was part of a family vaudeville act. And her career continued until in her 60s, when she had very bad circulation and she had to have a leg amputated. What we're looking at here, the hypertrine, is the Sun conjoined Moon, is trine to Jupiter, and in the center is a sextile of both of the ends of the trine with Pluto. And if you look at it, let's see. Let me pass on that. What the hypertrine is all about, with Pluto in the first house anchored there, Jupiter is in a fixed sign Taurus, and it's all about making people happy and being able to sustain happy feelings for as long as she could hold it, and she could hold it quite a long time. And she was an excellent comedian, and she was, again, somebody who was very photogenic, had a strong, strong presence. The Pluto in the first house is not weak at all. She had a strong presence on stage. But what happens is often that people who are entertainers and are on stage get a lot from the audience. And when they get stuff from the audience, they're uplifted and they want to stay that way. Rock singers resort to drugs to stay that way. What she did is she took the Neptune square Jupiter route. She wanted to continue to feel happy, so she was what you would call a happy drunk. And she drank a lot. And that's what messed up her entire circulation. And the fact that she wasn't getting nutrition, proper nutrition to her legs, so that they had to be amputated, it shows that with Jupiter involved, that it was most likely the arterial circulation that was involved. So here's somebody that brought a lot of people happiness, but tried to stay too happy with herself too long. She eventually, Jupiter again, showed high blood pressure, and then she had something like 9 strokes she had. And she was spent years in a wheelchair. You know, from her 60s, things went downhill. And what happened is she had in her prime, she had 6 marriages. And when she was 72 years old, she was visiting in Las Vegas, and a young man courted her, somebody that was 40 years, some years younger than her. And after 3 weeks of courtship, they married. And extreme difference in age. And what happened is that when she died, she left $1 million to her daughter, and all the rest she left to the guy. And they contested in court, and he won, because she was on record as saying, like, he brought me happiness for the first time in years. She said, I hadn't had sex for a decade, and he brought me joy that way and other ways, and she rewarded him. Now, this is the Jupiter-Pluto tries to be, or is naturally, a force for the good. But it's kind of a conservative good. You know, like the moral standards of society are right. And that describes her. Despite the fact that she had alcoholic problems, she was a devout Methodist. And Methodists don't believe in drinking. In fact, would you like to hear a joke? Yeah, what happens is this base commander in the army has to invite in the different chaplains, and he brings in 3 different chaplains. He brings in a Catholic chaplain, and a Methodist chaplain, and a Baptist chaplain. No Luthers, I'm sorry. And what he does is he gets a big hypodermic needle, and he puts lab alcohol inside of a watermelon. And after the meal is over, they have watermelon for dessert. And he watches them. And the Catholic priest, it's nothing unusual to him. He's sitting there enjoying, maybe talks a little bit more than usual, but it's all pretty standard for him. And he looks at the Methodist chaplain, and the Methodist can't get enough watermelon. He's putting it down as fast as he can. And then he looks over at the Baptist, and the Baptist is doing the same thing, but he's saving the seeds. Okay. She was also politically conservative, and just goes to show you that conservatives can have a lot of positivity in themselves also. All right. Now we come to one of my favorite all-time performers of all. Edgar Bergen. I loved Edgar Bergen.
How not to?
What?
How could you not?
Yes, yes. There's a very obvious hypertrine in here that describes his career. Uranus is... Oh, the sun is trying to moon, and the support planet with the 2 sextiles is Uranus. And that describes him a lot. It's very obvious. The Neptune here, almost, if it backs up a little bit, is almost in a grand trine with the sun. It is in orb with Jupiter, and comes close with the other 2 planets. So you have a near grand trine in the chart. He's somebody also that knew how to laugh and be happy, but certainly was the opposite of Martha Ray. He was extremely subtle. We see Saturn conjoin Mercury very close to the ascendant, and he was shy. And shy people develop subtlety. And that is what happened with him. And he didn't know how to fit in. And what happened is he spent 25 cents and out of a magazine or a comic book or something like that and bought a book on ventriloquism. And he was good at it. And this is a very adroit, a very dexterous kind of consciousness. Just all Aquarius stuff alone would be that. But when you have that hyper trine with the sextile trine, with Uranus being smack in the middle of it, that shows that kind of ability. He had a head carved for him by a carpenter, and that was Charlie McCarthy. And all of his dummies represented different facets of his personality. He had three dummies. Charlie McCarthy was one, and Charlie McCarthy was the clever, outspoken Mercury. But he still was self-conscious about his slowness, and the slowness was in a character called Mortimer Snerd, who talked extremely slowly. And his last dummy relates to another part of his life. He lived with his mother until he was 42 years old, and he was a confirmed bachelor. And he loved serious, curious old women. And so his final dummy was a hip old maid called Effie. And she was hip, all the Aquarian novelty, newness, and she had all those quirks, and she would say surprising things. When he was 42, his mother died. And shortly thereafter, he met a woman. And this was a man who, in a staid way, was never going to ever be married. And he and the woman fell in love. And within 2 or 3 weeks, he was married. And it really was a falling in love, a sudden surprise from the 8th house, because in their entire life, they never had a single spat. Not a single spat. They loved each other and got on with each other so well. Now, so he has this very adroit consciousness. But with the Aquarius, he can do it impersonally. He could make observations, shrewd observations, but when he would make statements, he would make them impersonally. It wasn't anything vindictive at all. I think you can find them on YouTube. I was going to take the time and look them up, but there are radio shows where every week Charlie McCarthy would have it out with W.C. Fields. And the sarcasm and the wit and such like was outrageous, but it was never nasty at all. The thing was that all of his characters, especially the little hip little old maid, used Uranus is surprising, and when things come out of the dark, the hidden secrets come out of the dark, he was a master of being able to surprise people. All right, now we're going to shift to the hypersquare, which is the T-square, the most basic of all of the triangles of construction, the isosceles right triangle, and not everything in construction is pleasant. So we have to deal with some unpleasantries this time. Demi Moore is a very good example of a T-square hypersquare. We have all these planets here, Sun, Venus, to a certain extent even Neptune, opposite the Moon. And then the off planet is Mars. So this is a classic T-square. It's a horoscope that is fascinating, but I can't look at it without feeling sad. There's always a certain amount of sadness about it. The principle of the square is the principle of construction. Everything is built at right angles. And Mars is the Lord of construction. So Mars rules the square. And so what we have here is a classic T-square. We have 7 planets in fixed sign. 4, 5, 6, 7 planets in fixed signs. So this is something that is very, very deeply built in. And with Mars driving it all, and a lot of the 4 of the fixed sign planets are in a martial sign, we have something here like a runaway train with nothing much to stop it. With this many squares, especially when Scorpio is involved, there's a likelihood to tearing down as much as there is in building. Now the Mars does square Neptune. In fact, it's its strongest square. So it shows that she has a charismatic passion. And she's drawn to people out of a charismatic passion. And she has Sun square Mars, which shows that she likes young men, and she's not afraid to fight with them. In fact, I wouldn't even be a bit surprised if there weren't fisticuffs. It's not a certain thing because Pisces rising is much more gentle than that, but I think she knows how to dish it out quite well. There is a weak square of Mars and Venus, which shows a strong tendency to get involved with dalliances. Mars square the Moon shows no control or no willingness to control primitive passions. So she has all of these emotional conditions and she does nothing to stop them. Again, it's like a semi with no brakes or like a freight train with no brakes. It just builds up momentum and that's it. Mars is the off planet. If it were only in opposition, there would be ambivalence or a deadlock or something like that. But with Mars, the off planet, it stimulates. It doesn't compensate, it stimulates. And so there's always another square coming up. And that keeps you off balance. And even the opposition itself is off balance because one side has all these planets on and the other side has only one planet. So this is a very, very tough chart. Now, if it were a Grant square, it would be much more stable. In fact, the Grant square is a pretty stable aspect altogether because it is an external rectangle as well as an internal rectangle. But if there were fulfillment in a Grant square, it would go into the 11th house, which means what this chart needs is a friend who can be cool, a friend who can be stable. And I'm not sure she has that. Her first husband, or their second, was Bruce Willis her second husband, right? Mark, do you know on that? He's sort of a friend, but he's not exactly a Pacific person himself. So she's likely to be falling into passion again and again and again. And this is the sad part of it. It's likely that she's not going to quickly learn her lesson. That, it's not bad to suffer, but it's tough to suffer and not learn. and to have something do so deeply inground you don't really even know what's going on. So I guess in almost all of these I'm showing my age by the people that I'm selecting, but I had very small amounts of selection this time. Generalissimo Francisco Franco. What? He's still dead, yeah. All right. For the things that we've been looking at for the last several talks, this is a World's Fair. There are all sorts of things in here, too much for us to be really comprehensive. First, we have the T-square. We have all of these planets here, Moon, Neptune, Pluto, and they are all opposite the Sun, and then the T-square, the moving planet, is again Mars. And this is, on top of that, there is a double 30-60-90. The Moon is trine to Saturn, and Saturn is sextile to Sun. The Moon is sextile to Jupiter, and Jupiter is trine the Sun. So what we have is a rectangle between these four planets, and the rectangle has a 30-60-90. And the 30-60-90 we're saying is one of those hyper aspect patterns. So we have two of those and a huge T-square. And the rectangular pattern of the two 30-60-90s put together means that Jupiter's opposite Saturn, and the ninth house planets are opposite the Sun. So more than half of the planets are in that rectangle. And that explains something that you couldn't explain it any other way astrologically. Now, if he is such a common sign person, I think there's only one fixed sign planet in here, two fixed sign planets, the two Scorpio planets over here. But most of the planets are in common signs, and there are common signs on the angles. So how could a man that has that many common signs and that many oppositions hold power for 30 years? It's, you know, he had an iron hand that he held it. And my contention is because it is that square figure, and the square figure produces something very stable. It's a rectangle. It's a 30-60-90 rectangle, and that is what held things into stability. He believed in stability to the core. If you remember when we were going through the trapezoid patterns, I said that the trapezoid patterns, there's a 60-60-60 trapezoid that is extremely stable. And it's extremely stable so that you don't even know that there's an opposition as part of it. And when you have a trapezoid that is a right trapezoid, which is what a rectangle is, you have something that is just like that. So we have two benefics for every malefic. That is to say, for every opposition, there's a sextile and a trine, at least. And in this case, there are, for these planets, there are 4 sextiles and trines for every one. So this is a very positive building thing. Now, so we have the stability understood. Now let's try to understand how he came to power. The off planet in all of this is the Mars. Mars is the planet that sets the T-square in action. Obviously, he was a military man, and by taking military action is what he did. His father was a small-timer in the army, and he got into the army, And by the time he was aged 33, he was the youngest general in all of Europe. And when trouble came out in Spain, he fought against everybody. So like common signs, he was against all sides. He was against the old republic, and he was against the leftists, and he prevailed. So the Mars, Pluto is dictatorial, and if the Sun, Pluto is dictatorial, you can see that there are dictatorial tendencies, and he does believe in clamping down, but that isn't what gives the stability. He did have charisma from the Mars Neptune, and the Mars Moon adds to that charisma by showing an emotional element. And this describes a lot. The ninth house shows that, ever since the breakdown of the Armada and of the Inquisition, Spain was basically a backward, superstitious country, and religion prevailed. The Catholic religion was very strong, and this shows that he was capable of aligning himself with the church in order to get into power and to stay into power. He was a conservative to the heart, because when he realized he was getting old, you know what he did? He brought the king back from the old republic. So he believed in law and order, and he believed even if the order had to be maintained fascistically, so be it. That's the way it had to be. Another dead person. All right. Joan Rivers. In this horoscope, we have two synergistic patterns. We have what we're looking at here, the sun opposite the moon. I chose a lot of sun opposite moon, full moon people, because they're more obvious. And they're T-squared with Jupiter and Mars. And the other synergistic pattern is the 30-60-90, the moon sextiles Saturn, and Saturn trines the sun. It's a really nice, strong 30-60-90. 6 of the 10 planets are in mercurial signs, 3 in Virgo and 3 in Gemini. You can see this is obviously someone who lives by her wits, and somebody who can live by her wits even when things are tough, because that the T-square is in common signs, and that means that somebody is able to adapt when there's adversity. Uranus in the first house, it's hard to find acceptance in the world. So she's an outsider. And being an outsider, there are unique observations that she makes. And Uranus is square to Pluto. And Uranus and Pluto are the two most rebellious planets, though they rebel in very different ways. Uranus is like a bomb-throwing revolutionary, and Pluto is like a biker. And so she's willing to be a rebel. So everything here, the T-square, is in common signs and in cadent houses. And that means that it's for the youth planets are in the 6th house, which means that she's an in-between person. I don't know how to say it. She's an activator that's an in-between person, as all common sign people are, and she can work from that vantage of things. Now, it has been said that there are two types of comedians. First, there are the clowns who say things funny, and then there are the wits who say funny things. And it's clear from this chart that she says funny things. But the instrumental planets, the moving planets, are Mars and Jupiter, and Mars rules the ascendant, and the moon is in Sagittarius. All of these things are high pride. And so she is someone that works with pride, and that's what touches her off. And the fact that Jupiter and Sagittarius are involved, it shows that there's another differentiation in humor. That is the difference between overstatement and understatement. When you juxtapose reality with an overstatement, the difference is funny. Or when you juxtapose reality with an understatement, the difference is funny. She is obviously an overstating person. Now, she's a driven person. And it's surprising with all these planets in the 6th house that she lived as long as she lived. Because that's not really great for it. My own belief is that she lived as long as she did because she got relief from tensions by being a comedian. Being a comedian is different than being a jazz musician. With jazz musician, you're dealing with all kinds of atonality and blues and things like that, and not a lot of jazz musicians live to be really old. But comedians can, because they have relief to their life. Interesting thing in passing is that when we looked at Michael Jackson's chart a few years ago, he had Neptune in the 1st house, and he did a lot of plastic surgery because that was his uniform, so to speak. That was the way he created his image. For her, it was just an expedient use of technology, and that's the way she treated it. Now, there's a lot of good that comes out of the 30, 60, 90, and the important person there, the out planet, is Saturn. She needed a stable person in her life. It wasn't either of her husbands. The first one she left because he was basically an anchor to her life, I guess. And her second husband committed suicide. So it wasn't from friends, because Saturn in the 11th house often does not have a lot of friends, especially stable friends. What it was a reflection from the 5th house. It was her daughter. And her daughter was the serious person that helped her deal with a life of constant travel, or deal with the constant chatter in life, and settled her down. All right. Yeah?
She had one of the best lines that I ever heard. Having children is extremely painful. Said, when I had my first one, I let off this blood-curdling yell. And she says, and that was just at conception.
One that some people wish were dead. This is probably one of the most wanted men in the world. This is the man that was the mastermind of the 9/11 bombings. He was the closest and the most trusted lieutenant of Osama bin Laden. He was a doctor from Cairo, from Egypt, and he did not like the influence of the United States on the Mideast. We're looking at the T-square here of Sun opposite Moon. You can put Mars in there if you like. And then the square to Saturn. A very clear T-square. And Saturn is the off-balance planet, and it's probably, if you add up everything with all of the aspects and all, Saturn is probably the strongest planet in the pattern and probably the whole horoscope. So with Saturn in such a position, it's likely that this is a hate-driven personality. Saturn square Mars are some of the lowest, most hateful base attitudes that you can have. Saturn square the moon, more of the same, extremely primitive and emotionally harsh in that way. And the focus in the ninth house shows that it was religious hatred. Now Jupiter is square to Uranus, and it's a pretty strong square, and that sometimes indicates someone who is religiously fanatic. But that's usually more when it's in fixed signs, and I don't know whether that counts here or not as contributing to fanaticism, so I can't say. The Mars square Saturn is very, very savage, but it's not. That's usually a frustration that causes a person to lash out savagely. What I think is involved is the Sun square Saturn. I think that there is a tremendous amount of self-dislike, even personal self-dislike, because Saturn is conjoined the ascendant. And the way I think it works is he projects his self-dislike to offense against his religion, and then he projects it out into the world through the ascendant as a hatred. That's all speculation, but it seems to make a lot of sense. Usually people who have a lot of hatred for other people are people who have a lot of hatred for themselves, and that seems to hold true with his horoscope.
Did you say he had an unusual mother?
Yeah, I don't know about the statement. I have no idea of what the relationship is with his mother, not at all. I couldn't. There usually when there are full moon people, sun opposite moon, there are often a lot of problems with personality developing because there's a conflict between the parents, and that's possible here. But that, it's hard to get information like that out of Islamic societies. Now, what's really ironic about all of this is Osama bin Laden became a United States hater when United States military planes started landing in Saudi Arabia. And they started bringing in culture, and he was offended by that. Osama bin Laden was much more religiously offended. But both he and Sahawari were, both of them hated the presence of the United States in the Mideast. And it's ironic that after all of this expression of hate, the United States presence in the Mideast is stronger than it's ever been before. And it backfired on them. I think people in the United States now would just assume that we didn't have a presence in the Mideast. All right.
That's Saturn right on the ascendant.
Yes.
What is that?
A dark, heavy personality. Oh, there's one thing I forgot to mention about it. There's one thing that's certain about Saturn in the 12th house and conjoined the ascendant is that he's a fugitive. He's in perpetual exile. Probably nobody in the world. We have a very good CIA, and probably nobody of them knows where he is. A very closely guarded secret. All right, now we're switching to the 30, 60, 90. We're looking at two 30, 60, 90 triangles. The base of the 30, 60, 90s is the Sun conjoined Pluto opposite Saturn. The Sun is sextile Mars, and Mars is trine to Saturn. The Sun is sextile to the moon, and the moon is trine to Saturn. So what we have are two 30, 60, 90 triangles, and they are put together in such a way that they produce a grand trine between Mars, Saturn, and the moon. And because they're put together that way, there is a hypertrine between the moon and Mars sextiling these two planets. So we have all kinds of patterns here that we've been looking at. We can see in this there's only one opposition, or one opposition with 3 planets in it. And all of these positive aspects, we expect something extremely positive here. Alice Munro, I've not read her at all. Have you read her, Ela? Is the most highly awarded and acclaimed living author. She has a bookstore, too, and probably loses money, too. It's Munro Books. She's a Nobel Prize winner. She's a Booker winner. I don't know if she's a Pulitzer winner, but she just has award after award after award. Now, she writes short stories, which you would expect with a Sun-Saturn person. It would be abbreviated. Jupiter is not strong in this horoscope, and so you don't expect something prolix like you would expect from the speaker. Who has Jupiter square Mercury, who is long-winded. Now, years ago, I used to hang out with the Fokies. And when I hung out with the Fokies, I saw that a lot of the Fokies had Cancerian qualities about them. There's sort of a closeness and even a clannishness about folk people. That clannishness is even carried into the moon in Taurus, which is extremely clannish, where it's exalted. The other thing I noticed about Fokies is that there's a strong Aquarius thing. The sort of like, even if it's in your own society, there's something cosmopolitan or something international about it. And so you would expect that what she writes about are folk things, intimate things about people. And that's exactly what her stories are all about. Now, I read analyses of her writing, and there are 2 things that characterize her writing, and both of them are shown in the horoscope. The first thing is that things develop very slowly. The Saturn alone would be enough to have a slow developing plot, and Pluto increases that a great deal. So you can see that the base for all of these aspects is to let something develop very slowly. The other thing is there's an ambiguity about situations, and that's very much the opposition. Is it this way or is it that way? And in some cases there's not a solution, and things are allowed to remain in ambiguity. A third thing that is common to her, it isn't in the structure, but in the choice of what she chooses to write about, is time. She has a lot of coming-of-age kinds of short stories, and like there's sort of a maturation event that takes place in them. Now, you still have to have movement. You still have to have something to hold the reader. You just can't have Gertrude Stein qualities, slow, ultra slow, that doesn't say anything. I'm not a Gertrude Stein fan. It's the hardest reading I've ever had in my life. And that is the Mars. That's where the 30, 60, 90 with the Mars comes in. There is energy. She doesn't do it by speed. Jerry couldn't stand her writing at all because Jerry likes action. She has energy, but it is more of a mental energy, and it captures you that way. The exalted moon shows that she has very clearly a strong feminine perspective. that she's clear. Even Cancer itself is extremely feminine in its nature, and so she writes coming of age stories. She writes them from a clear feminine perspective, and she doesn't have to make any political statements. Now, what's really interesting in this is that she writes a story, then she rewrites the story 3 or 4 more times, and she publishes all of the different variants. And that's partly the opposition, but that's not all of it. It is associated with the grand trine, because grand trines are usually mono-elemental. And in this case, the mono-element is Earth. So she'll see things from one perspective, and then something else will be triggered off, and she'll see it from another perspective, which doesn't contradict, but it adds and changes. And then she'll come to another perspective, and that gives you another viewpoint. And it's like, this is what happens. I have a friend who has many planets in air signs, who is also a writer, an extremely excellent writer. And what he does is he looks at things from a point of view, and then he'll stay within the element, and he'll look at it again. And so there is a building or a mounting type of quality that you have with the grand trine, and together with the structural back and forth ambiguities or ambivalences, it describes her work fairly well, or at least the reviews that I have read of her work. Do you think it? Yeah, I didn't go into the T-square. Ela is saying that there's also a T-square of Sun, Saturn, Uranus, and the Sun. Yeah, with Pluto. We would be here all night if I were to talk about everything that was all here. This is one of those nights I have to deal with people that I don't like at all. This is one of them. Huh?
Thank you for sharing. He's alive. What's the problem?
All right, this is another new moon person, full moon person. We have this is actually an eclipse person, the moon opposite the sun, and they both sextile. Sun sextiles Mars, and Mars trines they don't quite in orb for Mars. What it is the trine of Sun to Jupiter, and the sextile of the Moon to Jupiter. There's some of the planets are in orb to Mars, but not, and it's too much to try to say that it is a 60-60-60 trapezoid. The life would be more stable if it was. All right. People who are born under full moons, especially if they're eclipses, have identity problems. They can't be decisive about themselves. And so there's a lot of vacillation. And that is magnified by the fact that it's along the pole of Gemini and Sagittarius. What he tries to do is he tries to use the Uranus to get around that. He tries to make lightning strike decisions, right or wrong. I've never seen him hire or fire someone, but he likes to do it like a blitzkrieg. The outside planet, the resolution between between being undecisive and sometimes screwing up because he makes snap judgments, is Jupiter. Now this is puzzling to me. This would say that the problems of his personality are solved by Jupiter in Libra in the 2nd house. And I can't understand that. I can understand how it works. When I was in college, I used to go to college until I was running out of money, and then I'd go bumming for a while, and I'd go and live with my parents and work in a steel shop, and till I had enough money to go back to school again, and then I repeated the cycle 2 or 3 times like that. But when I was living with my parents working in the steel shop, my parents' house was a block away from the country club. And I would go to the country club and I would play poker. And I was making as much money playing poker because as I was working in the steel shop. And the only time I didn't make money playing poker is when the owner of the steel fabricating factory was in the game. And he was of a Donald Trump mentality. He would try to buy every pot. He had money galore. He was a millionaire, and here I'm a college student, and he would try to buy every pot, and he could get away with it because he had that much money. And little guys like myself and other would-be guys we didn't band together so that one of us would always challenge him if he wasn't buying a pot whether he had a good hand or not. And that's the kind of mentality that Donald Trump has. He tries to solve everything by, he gets these speculative hits, which are positive, but he buys everything in sight. Jupiter is square to Saturn, so his judgment isn't always good because he had to be bailed out several times. And he had to be bailed out by his creditors because he was too big to fail. He was almost like the banks were, only in a small way. But he defines himself by his wealth. And Neptune is square to Mercury, and Neptune is in the second house, and his wealth is not what he claims it to be. He's fraudulent about it. Like Forbes magazine has several times said, the figures that he gives us don't add up. He tries to make himself wealthier than what he really is. But nonetheless, his wealth did come from both planets that ruled the 8th house from the 2nd house. His father was a real estate developer, and he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. My take on this horoscope is that it isn't over yet. He doesn't do or hasn't done the benign things from the Jupiter in the 30, 60, 90. And what I'm hoping is that as life progresses in the latter part of life, he'll do something like Bill Gates and dedicate himself to charity work with his money. Because he certainly isn't going to leave anything to immortality from using his money the way he's used it now. Here's a statement from Astrology. I would say that he is not a conservative. The conservative planets usually are Pluto, which is not strong in this horoscope. It forms almost no aspects, and Saturn. Saturn does form the weak square to Jupiter, enough to show some bad judgment, but mostly it's involved with Venus. And Saturn-Venus represents love insecurities, and it usually represents differences in age. And he keeps marrying blondes. Each one is younger or more different in age than he is as time goes on. So I think that his statement as a conservative, he's just a blowhard. He is not a true conservative as Francisco Franco was, or some of the other horoscopes that we've looked at. All right. This is lasting very, very long. One more T-square person. This is a T-square person that I like. I don't even know she's alive anymore. Probably because I like her. She's dead already. All right. Ruth Westheimer. I like Dr. Ruth. At this point, my notes are pretty bad because I was pushing because I had spent a lot of time on this. What we have here is the sun, moon and Saturn together opposite the sun, and they sextile and trine. This is 30, 60, 90 with Mars. The sun is in the first house, and so she's sort of a self-made person. At least she's an authority on the basis of her own being. Now, the way it worked out with the sun opposite Saturn, she too had insecurities, and like the sun square Saturn that Zawahiri had and Alice Munro had, but she treats them differently. Her statement was that when she was young, she was living in Israel, and she says, I was short and ugly, and I didn't think anybody would ever marry me. And somebody did marry her, and it didn't work out in the long run. And then she was married to somebody who was almost like an athlete or something like that, and that didn't work out. And then finally she married Westheimer, who was short and ugly also, and that lasted. These are her own statements. I'm not making them up. We're talking about time in history. Even though she knew she was short and ugly and had not a good image of herself, she tried things. And when she tried things, she learned. She was pragmatic. And the 30, 60, 90, the off planet is the planet that gets things going. And in this case, it is Mars. And so it really got things going. And she did things and did things and did things. And she kept gaining more and more practical experience as time went on. And the thing I'd like to stress about it is there's nothing in here. If you let water run long enough, a stream will run itself clean. And a wind will blow in fresh air, and this is a wind that blew in fresh air. I do not think, despite all of the things she said on television, Dr. Ruth did not have a dirty mind. She thought she was talking about things of nature, and she thought these are things that happen in a relationship. And she talked freely about them. The way it works is she has Venus and Uranus in a sextile, which shows she even had a romanticism about her. She had Uranus square Mercury, which shows that she was very frank about things, perhaps even a little too frank. But this is somebody then that just is outspoken, and she may have been a little bit demanding. She has the Pluto situation that's demanding, but I'm getting tired and my notes are terrible, so we have one last horoscope. If we're going to finish, we've got to finish with somebody very good. This is meant to be a grand trine horoscope where you have that building quality. This is Tenzin Gyatso, who we know has His Holiness the Dalai Lama. This is this has a hypertrine in it again. We have the Sun sextile the Moon and Neptune, and we have Jupiter sextile the Moon and Neptune, and together they form a hypertrine pattern, but that's all part of a grand trine. It's really, this is a man, I guess you would say this is a man with the watery signs that is of a measured outpouring. The Saturn up there shows some measure to everything that he does. He is very, very careful. In Tibetan Buddhism, when they teach students, if you've ever gone out to any of the teachings out at Deer Park, for example, perfect example, they teach something incrementally slow. very, very small amounts. You might say homeopathic amounts. And that is what this man is like. I've attended his lectures, and he gives it out slowly in tiny doses. And Saturn, in his case, indicates the positive side of tradition as a means of improvement. Very often, tradition is ingrown, and it becomes a dark, heavy thing that you're locked into the tradition. But in his case, it shows that it can result, if done right, it results in something very positive. Saturn in the 10th house also indicates something that he may not like. It's a life of fame. He's not clear whether he likes his fame or not. The school, I think that he gives himself generously. The sun, the hypertrine and the sun trine Jupiter indicates that he gives himself, and he gives himself very well. The school of Tibetan Buddhism that he belongs to, I believe he's a Gelugpa. And they're very strong on working with imagery as part of spiritual development, holding images. I know one Gelugpa student that came to our prayer meetings says that's powerful stuff because you're holding images when you're doing healing prayers and things like that. And this shows the success that he had in his spiritual practices with imagery. But I think he's very well may be unhappy being in the position that he's in because you have Saturn opposite the off planets of the hypertrine. And they're in the 4th house. And my belief is that he would be much happier if he didn't have the destiny of having to be out into the world. He'd be much happier being at home, being a Tibetan monk. Sequestered away. Fortunate for the world that he's as positive as he is. It's an interesting thing when we talked about Alice Munro with the Grand Trine in her chart, that carries here too. This is a personal emotionality that is brought out in an expression, and it's brought out forcefully, strong, clearly, but it builds, and when it gets to the 3rd part up here, it gets to be compassion. And this is, he's keenly aware, even with the opposition, he's keenly aware of his limitations and how much sadness there is in the world, and it builds the compassion. Now, I didn't have time to dig out a grand trine pattern and a grand square pattern. It would have taken way too much. This was way too much as it is. So all that there is left to say is thank you. I've had a very happy 5 years. I hope everybody's learned a lot of astrology. I certainly did. And I'm very happy for all of it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for the great stories.